The fluorescent lights in my law office flickered as I leaned back in my leather chair, studying the stack of credit card statements spread across my mahogany desk like fallen leaves after a storm. Each one told the same haunting story. Small, seemingly insignificant charges that had somehow drained the life savings of elderly clients who trusted me to protect them. And after 37 years practicing elder law, I thought I had seen every scam, every scheme, every cruel trick that predators use to separate seniors from their hard-earned money. I was wrong. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in October. The autumn rain drummed against my office windows on the 15th floor, creating rivulets that distorted the view of downtown Portland below. My secretary, Margaret, had already arranged my appointments for the day when Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald walked through my door at precisely 9 o'clock, clutching her purse with both hands as if it contained the last remnants of her dignity. Eleanor was 83 years old, a retired school teacher with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that had once commanded respect from generations of third graders. Now those same eyes were filled with confusion and fear as she settled into the chair across from my desk, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something terrible has happened to my money, and I don't understand how." She placed a manila folder on my desk, and I could see it was stuffed with bank statements, credit card bills, and handwritten notes in her precise teacher's script. "I've been so careful my whole life. Harold and we saved every penny for 46 years of marriage. After he passed, I promised myself I'd make that money last." I opened the folder and began examining the documents while Eleanor continued her story. Her monthly Social Security check was $1,847, and she had managed to accumulate nearly $180,000 in savings over her lifetime. Not a fortune by today's standards, but enough to provide security for her remaining years. What I saw in those statements, however, made my stomach clench with a familiar dread. "Mrs. Fitzgerald," I said carefully, "I'm seeing charges here that seem unusual. Can you tell me about these?" I pointed to her credit card statement, where dozens of small charges appeared. $4.99 here, $7.50 there, $12.95 somewhere else. None were large enough to trigger immediate alarm, but together they painted a disturbing picture. Her face crumpled slightly. "That's just it, Mr. Harrington. I don't know what those charges are for. I called the credit card company, and they said they were all legitimate purchases I had authorized. But I never bought anything from Premium Wellness Solutions, or Digital Services Hub, or any of these other companies I've never heard of. I had handled enough elder abuse cases to recognize the signs, but this was different. The charges weren't the typical large, obvious, fraudulent transactions I was accustomed to seeing. These were small, regular, almost invisible, like financial termites eating away at the foundation of Eleanor's security. "Have you given your credit card information to anyone recently?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be more complicated than a simple yes or no. Eleanor's face flushed with embarrassment. "Well, there was this nice young man who called about a health supplement program. He said it was specifically designed for seniors, and there was a free trial. I only had to pay shipping, which was $4.99. He seemed so knowledgeable about my arthritis pain, and he knew I was a widow living alone. I thought, what harm could it do? My heart sank as the familiar pattern emerged. Eleanor had unknowingly become a victim of what I was beginning to recognize as a new and particularly insidious form of credit card fraud, one that was targeting seniors with surgical precision. Over the next hour, Eleanor and I went through her statements line by line. The initial $4.99 charge for shipping had indeed appeared, just as promised. But hidden in the fine print of the agreement she had never seen was authorization for recurring monthly charges for various premium services and exclusive member benefits. Within 3 months, Eleanor was being charged for a premium newsletter subscription, $19.95 monthly, enhanced customer support, $14.99 monthly. Personalized health consultations, $39.99 monthly, and at least 6 other services she had never requested or received. But it didn't stop there. Somehow, her credit card information had been shared with affiliated companies, each offering their own exclusive deals for seniors. A financial planning service charged her $24.99 monthly for reports she never received. A home security company billed her $49.99 monthly for monitoring services she never signed up for. A medication management app charged her $9.99 monthly, despite the fact that Eleanor had never owned a smartphone. "Mrs. Fitzgerald," I said gently, "in the past 6 months, you've been charged over $3,200 for services you never requested or received. This isn't your fault. You've become the victim of what I'm calling phantom charges, a new type of fraud that's specifically designed to target seniors like yourself." Tears began to flow down Eleanor's cheeks as the full scope of her victimization became clear. "But Mr. Harrington, when I called the credit card company, they said I had authorized all these charges. They made me feel like I was just a confused old woman who couldn't remember what she had signed up for. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the scheme. The scammers were careful to obtain just enough verbal or digital consent to create plausible deniability. When victims called to dispute the charges, they were met with recorded conversations or digital agreements that seemed to prove they had consented to the services. The victims were left questioning their own memories and mental capacity, exactly as the criminals intended. I assured Eleanor that we would fight every fraudulent charge and began the process of filing disputes with her credit card company. But even as I worked on her case, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was not an isolated victim. That afternoon, I called several of my colleagues who specialized in elder law to see if they had encountered similar cases. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Attorney after attorney confirmed they had seen an alarming increase in these types of cases over the past year. The pattern was always the same: seniors receiving targeted phone calls or emails about health products, financial services, or home security systems. The initial offer was always modest: a free trial, a small shipping charge, or a low-cost introductory service. But once the victims provided their credit card information, they found themselves trapped in a web of recurring charges for services they never wanted or received. My colleague Sarah Morrison in Seattle had just settled a case involving a 79-year-old man who had lost over $8,000 to phantom charges before his daughter discovered what was happening. Attorney James Chen in San Francisco was representing an 85-year-old woman who had been charged for 37 different services she had never signed up for. The scope of this fraud was becoming clear. It wasn't just affecting a few isolated individuals, but potentially thousands of seniors across the country. That evening, I stayed late in my office researching this new form of fraud. What I found was deeply disturbing. The scammers had created an entire ecosystem designed to exploit seniors' trust, loneliness, and unfamiliarity with digital contracts. They used sophisticated data mining to identify elderly individuals who lived alone, had good credit, and might be dealing with health issues or financial concerns. The initial contact was always warm and personal, designed to build trust and create a sense of urgency. The companies involved often had legitimate-sounding names and professional websites. They maintained call centers staffed with trained operators who knew exactly how to speak to seniors, using respectful language, expressing concern for their well-being, and creating a sense of community and belonging. Many of the victims I would later interview described feeling like the person on the phone truly cared about them, perhaps more than their own families did. The following week, Eleanor returned to my office with her daughter Susan, a middle-aged woman whose guilt was written across her face. "I should have been watching Mom's finances more carefully," Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. "After Dad died, I offered to help her with her bills, but she was so proud of her independence. She wanted to prove she could take care of herself. This family dynamic was another crucial element the scammers exploited. They understood that many seniors valued their independence and were reluctant to burden their adult children with their concerns. The scammers positioned themselves as helpful allies, offering support and services that busy families might not have time to provide. As I worked with Eleanor and Susan to unravel the web of fraudulent charges, I began to see the true sophistication of this scheme. The criminals had created a network of interconnected companies, each with slightly different business models, but all feeding off the same pool of victim information. Once a senior provided credit card details to one company, that information was shared with dozens of others, each ready to add their own phantom charges.
The timing of the charges was carefully orchestrated as well. They typically appeared at different times of the month, mixed in with legitimate purchases, making them difficult to spot during a casual review of monthly statements. The amounts were calculated to be just below the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud alerts from most credit card companies. Perhaps most insidiously, the scammers had learned to exploit the administrative burden of disputing charges. They knew that many seniors found the process of calling customer service, waiting on hold, and explaining their situation to multiple representatives exhausting and intimidating. Even when charges were successfully disputed, they would often reappear months later with slightly different company names or billing descriptors, hoping the victims would simply give up fighting them. 3 weeks into Eleanor's case, I received a call that would change everything. Margaret buzzed my intercom to announce that Detective Maria Santos from the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit was on the line. "Mr. Harrington," Detective Santos began, "I've been investigating a series of financial fraud cases targeting elderly residents, and your name has come up as representing several potential victims. I was wondering if we could meet to discuss what you've been seeing." Detective Santos was a 20-year veteran of the force who had specialized in elder abuse cases for the past decade. When we met the following day, she brought with her a thick file of police reports and a laptop containing evidence that painted an even more alarming picture of the phantom charge scheme. "What you're dealing with isn't just individual cases of fraud," she explained as we sat in my conference room. "This is an organized criminal enterprise that's operating on a national scale. We've identified at least 47 companies involved in this scheme, with operations in 12 states. They're targeting seniors specifically because they know this demographic is less likely to report fraud and more likely to blame themselves when they become victims." Detective Santos showed me surveillance footage from a raid on one of the call centers involved in the scheme. Rows of cubicles filled with operators working from scripts designed to manipulate seniors into providing credit card information. Wall-mounted monitors displayed real-time statistics showing call volumes, conversion rates, and revenue generated per hour. It looked more like a legitimate business operation than a criminal enterprise, which was exactly the point. "The really troubling part," Detective Santos continued, "is how much personal information these scammers have access to. They're buying data from legitimate marketing companies that sell lists of seniors' names, addresses, phone numbers, and purchasing histories. They know what medications you take, what magazines you subscribe to, whether you live alone, and what your approximate income level is before they ever make that first call." This explained why Eleanor and so many other victims had been struck by how much the caller seemed to know about their personal situations. It wasn't intuition or good salesmanship, it was detailed intelligence gathering that allowed the scammers to craft perfectly targeted pitches for each potential victim. As Detective Santos and I compared notes, we realized that the phantom charge scheme was just one part of a much larger operation. The same criminal network was also involved in Medicare fraud, investment scams, and charity fraud. They had created a comprehensive system for identifying and exploiting vulnerable seniors across multiple vectors. The economic impact was staggering. Detective Santos estimated that seniors in the Portland metropolitan area alone had lost over $4.2 million to phantom charges in the past 18 months. Extrapolated nationally, the scheme was likely costing elderly Americans tens of millions of dollars per year. But the financial losses were only part of the damage. Every victim I met with told the same story of shame, confusion, and loss of confidence. Many had stopped using credit cards entirely, cutting themselves off from the convenience and protection that these payment methods could provide when used safely. Others had become suspicious of all phone calls and mail, isolating themselves from legitimate services and social connections out of fear of being victimized again. Eleanor's case became my window into understanding the psychological impact of phantom charge fraud. During one of our meetings, she confessed that she had stopped answering her phone entirely, even calls from her daughter and grandchildren, because she was afraid of being tricked again. "I used to pride myself on being sharp," she said, staring out my office window at the gray Portland sky. "I taught school for 38 years. I raised 4 children. I managed our family's finances for decades. But these people made me feel like a fool. Now I question every decision I make. What if I'm not as mentally capable as I thought I was? What if I'm just a confused old woman?" This self-doubt was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the phantom charge scheme. The scammers didn't just steal money. They stole their victims' confidence, independence, and sense of self-worth. Many seniors I counseled expressed feelings similar to Eleanor's, wondering if the fraud was actually a sign of cognitive decline rather than sophisticated criminal manipulation. Working with Detective Santos, I began to develop a comprehensive approach to fighting phantom charge fraud. We established a task force that included representatives from local banks, credit card companies, senior centers, and social service agencies. Our goal was not just to help individual victims recover their losses, but to create a system for preventing others from falling victim to these schemes. One of our first initiatives was a series of educational seminars at senior centers throughout the Portland area. I had given many talks over the years about various forms of elder financial abuse, but these sessions were different. The phantom charge scheme was so new and sophisticated that many seniors, and even many professionals who worked with them, had never heard of it. The first seminar I conducted was at the Southeast Portland Community Center on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. About 30 seniors had gathered in a room that smelled of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. As I looked out at their faces, some skeptical, others worried, all attentive, I realized that Eleanor could have been any one of them. "How many of you have received phone calls in the past year from companies offering health supplements, financial services, or home security systems?" I began. Nearly every hand in the room went up, which was exactly what I had expected and feared. I spent the next hour walking them through the anatomy of a phantom charge scam, using Eleanor's case as an example. I explained how the initial contact was designed to build trust and create urgency, how the small initial charge was just the beginning of a much larger scheme, and how the recurring charges were carefully crafted to avoid detection. The questions that followed were both heartbreaking and enlightening. A 76-year-old man named Robert raised his hand to ask, "But what if the person on the phone really does seem to care about me? My own kids barely call anymore, but this fellow from the health company calls every month to check on how I'm feeling." This question struck at the heart of why the phantom charge scheme was so effective. The scammers understood that many seniors were lonely and isolated, craving human connection and attention. They exploited this basic human need by positioning themselves as caring allies rather than predatory salespeople. An 80-year-old woman named Grace shared her own experience. "I got one of those calls about a medical alert system. The man said he was calling because I live alone, and my neighbors had expressed concern about my safety. How would he know that unless someone legitimate was looking out for me?" I explained that the scammers had access to detailed demographic data that allowed them to craft highly personalized pitches. They knew who lived alone, who had recently been widowed, who had health issues, and who might be experiencing financial stress. This information allowed them to create the illusion of genuine care and concern. As the seminar continued, I began to see hands shoot up around the room as attendees realized they might have been victims themselves. A retired nurse named Patricia described monthly charges for a newsletter she had never received. A former accountant named William recognized charges for financial planning services he had never signed up for. By the end of the session, nearly half the attendees had identified potential phantom charges on their own credit card statements. This pattern repeated itself at every seminar I conducted over the following weeks. The scope of the victimization was far broader than even Detective Santos and I had initially estimated. For every case that was reported to police or brought to an attorney, there were dozens more that went unrecognized or unreported. Meanwhile, Eleanor's case was progressing through the dispute process with her credit card company. What should have been a straightforward matter of reversing fraudulent charges had become a months-long battle with customer service representatives who seemed determined to blame the victim rather than investigate the fraud. During one particularly frustrating phone call, a customer service supervisor actually suggested that Eleanor might be experiencing memory problems and should have a family member manage her finances. Eleanor was so humiliated by this conversation that she considered dropping her dispute entirely rather than continue to face such treatment. This response from financial institutions was another layer of the problem I was beginning to understand. Credit card companies were often ill-equipped to handle phantom charge fraud because it didn't fit the typical patterns of credit card abuse they were trained to recognize. The charges appeared to be legitimate because the scammers had obtained some form of consent, however deceptively.
I began working with Susan, Eleanor's daughter, to document every aspect of her mother's case. We gathered phone records, recorded conversations with customer service representatives, and compiled evidence showing that Eleanor had never received any of the services she was being charged for. The process was exhausting and time-consuming, requiring dozens of hours of work to recover a few $1,000s in fraudulent charges. This administrative burden was another cruel aspect of the phantom charge scheme. The scammers understood that many seniors would simply give up, rather than navigate the complex process of disputing charges. They counted on victim fatigue and the tendency of financial institutions to favor merchants over cardholders in ambiguous situations. As winter settled over Portland, I found myself thinking about Eleanor's case and the broader phantom charge scheme even outside of work hours. The sophistication and cruelty of the operation bothered me in ways that other forms of elder abuse had not. These weren't desperate individuals making poor choices. This was organized crime that had industrialized the process of exploiting seniors. The breakthrough in Eleanor's case came from an unexpected source. Detective Santos called me on a Friday afternoon in December with exciting news. "We've arrested 3 individuals involved in the phantom charge operation," she said. "During the search of their offices, we found records showing exactly how your client's information was shared between companies. This should be enough to prove to her credit card company that she was the victim of organized fraud." The evidence Detective Santos had gathered was damning. Computer records showed that Eleanor's credit card information had been sold to 14 different companies within hours of her initial call about the health supplement. Each company had been instructed to wait different intervals before beginning their charges to avoid detection. There were even detailed notes about Eleanor's personality profile, describing her as trusting and unlikely to dispute charges. With this evidence in hand, Eleanor's credit card company finally agreed to reverse all the fraudulent charges and implement additional protections on her account. After 5 months of fighting, Eleanor recovered $3,847 in phantom charges. But the victory felt hollow when I considered how many other seniors were still being victimized by the same scheme. The arrests Detective Santos had made were significant, but they represented only a tiny fraction of the criminal network involved in phantom charge fraud. For every call center that was shut down, 2 more seemed to spring up in different locations. The scammers had learned to be mobile and adaptable, moving their operations frequently to stay ahead of law enforcement. In January, I received a call that reminded me how widespread the phantom charge problem had become. The caller was attorney Jennifer Walsh from Miami, Florida, who had gotten my name from a colleague who had heard me speak at a legal conference about elder financial abuse. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I've got 17 clients who have been victimized by what sounds like the same phantom charge scheme you've been dealing with in Portland. The pattern is identical. Initial contact about health products or services, small initial charges, then recurring monthly billing for services they never received. I was hoping you could share what you've learned about fighting these cases." Over the next hour, Jennifer and I compared notes about our respective cases. The similarities were striking. The same company names appeared in both Portland and Miami. The same tactics were being used to target victims, and both of us were encountering the same resistance from credit card companies when trying to reverse the fraudulent charges. Jennifer's cases were particularly heartbreaking. One of her clients, a 91-year-old man named Carlos, had lost over $12,000 to phantom charges over the course of 2 years. His family had only discovered the fraud when Carlos had to be hospitalized and his son took over managing his finances. The worst part, Jennifer told me, is that Carlos keeps apologizing to his family for being stupid enough to fall for the scam. He's a retired engineer who designed bridges for 40 years, but these criminals have convinced him that he's lost his mental faculties. This pattern of self-blame was something I had observed in almost every phantom charge victim I had counseled. The scammers were experts at manipulating their victims not just into providing credit card information, but into feeling responsible for their own victimization. This psychological manipulation made victims less likely to report the fraud and more likely to continue paying the charges rather than face the perceived humiliation of admitting they had been deceived. Jennifer and I decided to coordinate our efforts to fight phantom charge fraud. We began sharing information about the companies involved, the tactics being used, and the most effective strategies for helping victims recover their losses. Over the following weeks, other attorneys from across the country joined our informal network as they encountered their own phantom charge cases. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of a criminal enterprise that operated on a truly national scale. The same companies and individuals appeared in cases from Seattle to Miami, from Phoenix to Boston. The scammers had created a sophisticated operation that could target seniors anywhere in the country with the same ruthless efficiency. By February, our informal network of attorneys had grown to include over 30 legal professionals who were representing phantom charge victims. We had documented cases involving more than 200 seniors who had collectively lost over $680,000 to the scheme. These numbers represented only the cases that had come to the attention of attorneys. The true scope of the victimization was certainly much larger. One of the most disturbing aspects of the phantom charge scheme was how it evolved and adapted over time. As Detective Santos and her colleagues shut down call centers and arrested individual operators, the criminals behind the scheme simply changed their tactics and moved their operations to new locations. I saw this adaptability firsthand when Eleanor received another suspicious phone call in March, nearly 6 months after we had successfully reversed her phantom charges. This time, the caller claimed to be from a credit monitoring service that had detected suspicious activity on Eleanor's account. The caller offered to provide premium protection services for a small monthly fee. Eleanor, now educated about phantom charge tactics, recognized the call as another scam attempt and hung up immediately. But she was shaken by the experience. "Mr. Harrington," she said when she called to tell me about the incident, "how do they know to target me again? I thought once I was out of their system, I would be safe." Unfortunately, Eleanor's name and information were now permanently part of the databases that scammers shared with each other. Once someone had been successfully victimized, they were considered a valuable target for future schemes. Eleanor would likely continue to receive these types of calls for years to come. This realization led me to focus more heavily on prevention rather than just helping individual victims recover their losses. Working with Detective Santos and our network of attorneys, I began developing comprehensive educational materials specifically designed to help seniors recognize and avoid phantom charge schemes before they became victims. The educational campaign we launched in the spring included several components. We created a simple checklist that seniors could use to evaluate suspicious phone calls or emails. We developed scripts they could use to end unwanted sales calls safely. Most importantly, we worked to change the narrative around financial fraud victimization, emphasizing that being targeted by these schemes was not a sign of mental decline or personal weakness, but rather evidence of sophisticated criminal manipulation. The checklist we developed included warning signs that seniors should watch for: unsolicited calls about health products or services, high-pressure sales tactics that created artificial urgency, requests for credit card information over the phone, offers that seemed too good to be true, and callers who claimed to know personal information about the potential victim's living situation or health concerns. We also created a network of phantom charge spotters, family members, friends, and caregivers who were trained to recognize the signs that a senior might be falling victim to recurring charge fraud. These spotters learned to look for unexplained charges on credit card statements, changes in spending patterns, and signs that their loved one might be receiving suspicious phone calls. The response to our educational campaign was encouraging, but it also revealed the enormous scope of the phantom charge problem. Every seminar I conducted brought forward new victims who had never realized they were being defrauded. Many had been paying phantom charges for months or even years without recognizing them as fraudulent. One particularly memorable case involved a 78-year-old woman named Margaret who attended one of my seminars at the Beaverton Senior Center. Margaret had been paying monthly charges for what she believed was a prescription discount program that would help her afford her diabetes medications. The charges were only $29.99 per month, which seemed reasonable for a service that promised to save her hundreds of dollars annually. When Margaret tried to use her discount card at the pharmacy, however, she discovered that it provided no actual benefits. The card was worthless, and the company that had issued it existed only to collect monthly fees from victims like herself. Margaret had been paying these charges for over 2 years, losing nearly $720 to the scam. What made Margaret's case particularly tragic was that she had actually delayed filling some of her prescriptions because she couldn't afford them, believing that the discount card would help her manage the costs. The phantom charges weren't just stealing her money. They were potentially endangering her health by creating false expectations about her ability to afford necessary medications. Cases like Margaret's reinforced my understanding that phantom charge fraud wasn't just a financial crime. It was a form of elder abuse that could have wide-ranging consequences for victims' physical and emotional well-being. The psychological impact of being deceived and manipulated often lingered long after the financial losses had been recovered. As our campaign to combat phantom charge fraud gained momentum throughout the spring and summer, I began to see some encouraging signs of progress. Credit card companies were starting to recognize phantom charges as a distinct form of fraud that required specialized response procedures. Several major issuers implemented new policies that made it easier for seniors to dispute recurring charges they hadn't explicitly authorized. Law enforcement agencies were also adapting their approaches to address phantom charge schemes more effectively. Detective Santos worked with federal investigators to trace the money flows and identify the individuals at the top of the criminal organizations. These efforts led to several significant arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in fraudulent proceeds. But perhaps the most important progress was in the seniors themselves. The educational campaign had created a network of informed consumers who were much better equipped to recognize and avoid phantom charge schemes. When I conducted follow-up surveys with seminar attendees, over 85% reported that they had successfully identified and avoided at least one suspicious phone call or email since attending the educational session. Eleanor had become one of our most effective advocates for phantom charge awareness. She volunteered to speak at senior centers throughout the Portland area, sharing her own story and encouraging other seniors to examine their credit card statements carefully. Her willingness to discuss her victimization openly helped reduce the stigma that prevented many seniors from reporting fraud or seeking help. During one of Eleanor's presentations, a 90-year-old man named Frank approached her afterward with tears in his eyes. "Thank you for having the courage to talk about this," he said. "I've been paying charges for services I never signed up for, but I was too embarrassed to tell anyone. I thought it meant I was losing my mind." Frank's reaction was typical of many seniors who attended our educational sessions. The phantom charge scheme was so sophisticated and the victims so carefully chosen that many people blamed themselves rather than recognizing that they had been targeted by professional criminals. Working with Frank, we discovered that he had been victimized by an even more elaborate version of the phantom charge scheme than Eleanor had encountered. The criminals had not only signed him up for recurring services he hadn't requested, but they had also used his credit card information to make purchases from legitimate retailers, then sold those items for cash. Frank's credit card statements showed hundreds of small purchases from electronics stores, department stores, and online retailers, purchases he had never made but that appeared legitimate to customer service representatives. This evolution of the phantom charge scheme into more traditional credit card fraud worried Detective Santos and me considerably. It suggested that the criminal networks were becoming more sophisticated and more willing to engage in obviously illegal activities rather than relying on the gray areas of deceptive marketing practices. As autumn approached, Marking nearly a year since Eleanor had first walked into my office, I reflected on how much I had learned about phantom charge fraud and elder financial abuse more broadly. The scheme had opened my eyes to vulnerabilities in our financial system and our society that I had never fully appreciated. The phantom charge criminals had identified and exploited several systemic weaknesses: the isolation and loneliness that many seniors experienced, the complexity of modern financial services, the limited protections available to consumers in recurring charge situations, and the tendency of institutions to blame victims rather than investigate fraud claims thoroughly. But I had also seen remarkable resilience and strength in the seniors I'd worked with. Eleanor had transformed from a confused and frightened victim into a confident advocate for fraud prevention. Margaret had not only recovered her losses, but had also helped several of her neighbors identify phantom charges on their own accounts. Frank had overcome his embarrassment about being victimized and had become a volunteer fraud spotter for his retirement community. The network of attorneys fighting phantom charge fraud had grown to include over 50 legal professionals representing more than 500 victims nationwide. We had collectively recovered over $2.3 million in fraudulent charges and had helped change policies at major credit card companies to better protect seniors from recurring charge abuse. Detective Santos had worked with federal investigators to dismantle 3 major phantom charge operations, leading to the arrest of 47 individuals and the seizure of over $8 million in criminal proceeds. But she was realistic about the ongoing nature of the threat. For every operation we shut down, she told me during one of our regular strategy meetings, 2 more seem to pop up somewhere else. These criminals are like weeds. You can cut them down, but if you don't get the roots, they just keep coming back. The roots Detective Santos referred to were the underlying conditions that made phantom charge fraud possible: the availability of detailed personal information about seniors, the ease of setting up recurring billing relationships, the limited oversight of telemarketing operations, and the social isolation that made many seniors vulnerable to manipulative sales tactics. Addressing these root causes would require systemic changes that went far beyond law enforcement or legal advocacy. It would require reforms to data privacy laws, stronger regulation of recurring billing practices, better oversight of telemarketing operations, and comprehensive efforts to reduce social isolation among seniors. As I wrote this account of my year-long journey into the world of phantom charge fraud, I wanted to ensure that every senior who might read or hear these words understood the essential facts about this devastating scheme. The criminals behind phantom charges are sophisticated professionals who have studied senior psychology and financial behavior to create nearly perfect traps for their victims. They begin by identifying seniors who live alone, have good credit, and might be dealing with health concerns or financial worries. They use detailed personal information purchased from marketing companies to craft highly personalized pitches that create the illusion of genuine care and concern. The initial offer is always modest: a free trial, a small shipping charge, or a low-cost introductory service. Once victims provide their credit card information, however, they become trapped in a web of recurring charges for services they never wanted or received. The charges are carefully designed to avoid detection. Small amounts that appear at different times of the month, mixed in with legitimate purchases, and below the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud alerts. When victims try to dispute these charges, they often encounter customer service representatives who blame them for the fraud rather than investigating the claims. The administrative burden of fighting phantom charges is deliberately exhausting, designed to convince victims to give up rather than continue pursuing their disputes. The psychological impact of phantom charge fraud often exceeds the financial damage. Victims frequently blame themselves for being stupid or gullible rather than recognizing that they have been targeted by professional criminals. This self-blame can lead to social isolation, loss of confidence, and reluctance to use financial services that could actually benefit them. But there is hope for preventing and fighting phantom charge fraud. Seniors who understand the tactics used by these criminals are much less likely to become victims. Family members and caregivers who know what warning signs to look for can help protect their loved ones from these schemes. Credit card companies that implement appropriate protections can make it much harder for phantom charge criminals to succeed. Most importantly, seniors who do become victims of phantom charges should never blame themselves or feel ashamed about seeking help. Being targeted by these schemes is not a sign of mental decline or personal weakness. It is evidence of sophisticated criminal manipulation that has been carefully designed to exploit basic human needs for connection and security. The phantom charge scheme represents a new evolution in elder financial abuse, one that takes advantage of technological and social changes to victimize seniors with unprecedented efficiency and scale. But it also represents an opportunity for our society to develop better systems for protecting our most vulnerable citizens from financial predators. Through education, advocacy, law enforcement, and systemic reform, we can make phantom charge fraud much more difficult to execute and much less profitable for the criminals involved. The seniors I have worked with over the past year have shown remarkable courage and resilience in fighting back against these schemes. They deserve our support and protection as they work to maintain their independence and dignity in the face of increasingly sophisticated threats. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the school teacher who first introduced me to the world of phantom charge fraud, continues to live independently in her own home. She has recovered from her financial losses and has regained confidence in her ability to manage her own affairs. But she remains vigilant about the ongoing threat of financial fraud, and she continues to share her story with other seniors to help them avoid similar victimization. Mr. Harrington, she told me during our most recent meeting, I used to think that getting old meant becoming helpless and dependent on others. But fighting these criminals has taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I may be 83 years old, but I'm not going to let anyone take advantage of me or my friends. Eleanor's transformation from victim to advocate represents the best possible outcome in phantom charge cases, but it should not obscure the fundamental injustice of a society that allows professional criminals to target seniors with such sophisticated and devastating schemes. Every senior citizen deserves to live with dignity, security, and confidence in their financial well-being. They deserve to be able to answer their phones without fear of manipulation, to use their credit cards without worrying about phantom charges, and to trust that the institutions designed to protect them will actually do so. The phantom charge scheme I have described in these pages is not just a financial crime. It is an assault on the basic human dignity of our seniors. It exploits their loneliness, their trust, their desire to maintain independence, and their unfamiliarity with modern technology to systematically drain their life savings. It transforms the very qualities we should celebrate in our elders, their kindness, their politeness, their willingness to help others, into vulnerabilities that can be ruthlessly exploited. But this story is not just about victimization. It is also about resilience, community, and the power of knowledge to protect the vulnerable from predators. Every senior who has learned to recognize phantom charge tactics, every family member who has become a vigilant financial spotter, every credit card company that has implemented better protections, and every law enforcement officer who has worked to dismantle these criminal networks has contributed to making our society safer for its most vulnerable members. The battle against phantom charge fraud is far from over. As I write these words, new victims are being targeted every day by criminals who continue to evolve and adapt their tactics. But the network of defenders has grown stronger as well. Attorneys like myself and Jennifer Walsh continue to represent victims and push for systemic changes. Detectives like Maria Santos continue to investigate and prosecute the criminals behind these schemes. Advocates like Eleanor Fitzgerald continue to educate and empower other seniors to protect themselves. The phantom charge scheme has taught me that elder financial abuse is not just a legal problem or a law enforcement problem. It is a societal problem that requires a comprehensive response. We must address the social isolation that makes seniors vulnerable to manipulation. We must reform the systems that allow personal information to be bought and sold without meaningful consent. We must hold financial institutions accountable for protecting their customers rather than simply processing transactions. We must create better support systems for seniors who want to maintain their independence while staying safe from financial predators. Most importantly, we must change the narrative around elder financial abuse. Seniors who are victimized by phantom charges and similar schemes are not weak, confused, or incompetent. They are ordinary people who have been targeted by extraordinary criminals using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. The shame and blame that many victims feel should be redirected toward the systems that failed to protect them and the criminals who exploited their trust. As I conclude this account, I want to address directly the seniors who may be reading or listening to these words. If you recognize yourself in Eleanor's story, or Margaret's story, or Frank's story, please know that you are not alone and you are not to blame. The phantom charge criminals who may have targeted you are professionals who have studied senior psychology and behavior to create nearly perfect traps. Falling victim to their schemes is not a sign of mental decline or personal weakness. It is evidence that you possess the very human qualities of trust and kindness that these criminals ruthlessly exploit. If you suspect that you may be the victim of phantom charges, please take action immediately. Review your credit card statements carefully, looking for small recurring charges from companies you don't recognize or services you never signed up for. Contact your credit card company to dispute any suspicious charges and don't accept initial denials. Escalate your dispute to supervisors if necessary. Consider consulting with an attorney who specializes in elder financial abuse if the amounts involved are significant or if you're having trouble navigating the dispute process alone. Most importantly, don't let the experience of being victimized by phantom charges destroy your confidence or independence. You can learn to protect yourself from future schemes without retreating from the world or becoming suspicious of everyone who contacts you. The key is education, understanding how these scams work, what warning signs to look for, and what resources are available to help you if you do become a target. For family members and caregivers who are concerned about phantom charge fraud, the most important thing you can do is maintain open communication with your senior loved ones about their financial activities. Many phantom charge victims suffer in silence because they're embarrassed about being deceived or afraid that admitting victimization will lead to a loss of independence. Create an environment where your senior family members feel comfortable discussing suspicious phone calls, emails, or charges they don't understand. Offer to help review their credit card statements regularly, not as a way of taking control of their finances, but as a collaborative effort to spot potential problems early. Learn to recognize the warning signs of phantom charge victimization, including unexplained changes in spending patterns, reluctance to discuss financial matters, or mentions of new services they've signed up for. For policymakers and financial industry leaders who may encounter this account, please understand that phantom charge fraud represents a systemic failure that requires systemic solutions. Individual victims and their families should not bear the entire burden of protecting themselves from sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploit weaknesses in our financial and regulatory systems. Credit card companies must implement better protections for seniors, including enhanced fraud detection systems that can identify patterns of phantom charging, simplified dispute processes that don't require victims to navigate complex bureaucracies, and proactive outreach to cardholders who may be at risk. The current system too often treats phantom charge victims as problems to be managed rather than customers to be protected. Regulatory agencies must strengthen oversight of recurring billing practices, particularly those that target seniors. The ease with which phantom charge criminals can establish merchant accounts and begin billing consumers for non-existent services represents a fundamental failure of oversight that allows these schemes to flourish. Data privacy laws must be strengthened to prevent the sale of detailed personal information about seniors to anyone who wants to purchase it. The phantom charge criminals I have encountered had access to remarkably detailed information about their victims' living situations, health concerns, and financial circumstances. Information that should never be available to potential predators. Law enforcement agencies must continue to prioritize elder financial abuse cases and develop specialized expertise in investigating complex phantom charge schemes. These crimes often cross state and national boundaries, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The criminals behind these schemes are sophisticated and well-funded, and they require an equally sophisticated law enforcement response. Telecommunications companies and internet service providers must take greater responsibility for preventing their networks from being used to facilitate phantom charge fraud. The robocalls and deceptive websites that are essential components of these schemes should be much more difficult to establish and maintain. Senior service organizations, community centers, and healthcare providers must expand their efforts to educate seniors about phantom charge fraud and other financial scams. Many victims I have worked with had never heard of phantom charges until they became ours, and the time to make it is now. Every day we delay in addressing phantom charge fraud comprehensively. More seniors fall victim to these devastating schemes. Every day we fail to implement better protections. More families are torn apart by financial losses and psychological trauma that could have been prevented. But every day we also have the opportunity to do better. Every educational seminar that teaches seniors to recognize phantom charge tactics, every policy change that makes these schemes more difficult to execute, every arrest of the criminals behind these operations, and every recovery of fraudulent charges represents a step toward a more just and protective society. The phantom charge criminals may have sophisticated technology, detailed personal information, and carefully crafted psychological manipulation techniques, but we have something more powerful. The determination to protect those we care about, the knowledge to recognize and counter their tactics, and the community connections that can support vulnerable individuals without controlling or patronizing them. Eleanor Fitzgerald's journey from victim to advocate illustrates the transformation that is possible when seniors are given the tools and support they need to fight back against financial predators. Her courage in sharing her story, her determination to help others avoid similar victimization, and her refusal to let criminal manipulation destroy her confidence or independence represent the best of human resilience and community spirit. As I close this account, I am reminded of something Eleanor said during one of our final meetings. "Mr. Harrington, I used to think that the worst thing about getting older was becoming helpless. But I've learned that the worst thing is actually being made to feel helpless by people who want to take advantage of you. Once you understand the difference, you can fight back." Eleanor's insight captures the essence of what I have learned about phantom charge fraud and elder financial abuse more broadly. The criminals behind these schemes don't just want to steal money. They want to make their victims feel helpless, confused, and ashamed. They want seniors to doubt their own judgment, to isolate themselves from potential support systems, and to accept victimization as an inevitable consequence of aging. But aging does not mean accepting victimization, and seniors are not helpless in the face of phantom charge fraud. Armed with knowledge about how these schemes work, supported by families and communities that value their independence and dignity, and protected by institutions that prioritize their well-being over administrative convenience, seniors can maintain both their autonomy and their security. The phantom charge scheme represents a test of our societal values and priorities. Will we allow sophisticated criminals to prey upon our most vulnerable citizens? Or will we create systems and communities that protect without patronizing, that support without controlling, and that value the wisdom and experience of our seniors while acknowledging their right to independence and dignity? The answer to this question lies not just with policymakers and institutions, but with each of us as members of communities and families. We all have roles to play in creating a society where phantom charge fraud cannot flourish, where seniors are valued and protected, and where growing older is associated with respect and security rather than vulnerability and fear. This is my challenge to everyone who has read or heard this account. Learn the warning signs of phantom charge fraud. Share this knowledge with the seniors in your life. Support institutions and policies that protect vulnerable consumers without restricting their freedom. And never accept the idea that being victimized by financial predators is a normal or inevitable part of aging. The phantom charge criminals may be everywhere, but so are the opportunities to stop them. Together, we can build a society worthy of our seniors' trust, a society that protects them from predators while honoring their independence, that values their contributions while acknowledging their vulnerabilities, and that treats aging as a source of wisdom and respect rather than an invitation for exploitation. Eleanor Fitzgerald and the dozens of other phantom charge victims I have represented deserve nothing less. And neither do the millions of seniors across our nation who are aging with dignity, contributing to their communities, and trusting that the society they help build will protect them in return. That trust is not misplaced if we choose to honor it. The choice and the responsibility belongs to all of us. This account, please understand that phantom charge fraud represents a systemic failure that requires systemic solutions. Individual victims and their families should not bear the entire burden of protecting themselves from sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploit weaknesses in our financial and regulatory systems. Credit card companies must implement better protections for seniors, including enhanced fraud detection systems that can identify patterns of phantom charging, simplified dispute processes that don't require victims to navigate complex bureaucracies, and proactive outreach to cardholders who may be at risk. The current system too often treats phantom charge victims as problems to be managed rather than customers to be protected. Regulatory agencies must strengthen oversight of recurring billing practices, particularly those that target seniors. The ease with which phantom charge criminals can establish merchant accounts and begin billing consumers for non-existent services represents a fundamental failure of oversight that allows these schemes to flourish. Data privacy laws must be strengthened to prevent the sale of detailed personal information about seniors to anyone who wants to purchase it. The phantom charge criminals I have encountered had access to remarkably detailed information about their victims' living situations, health concerns, and financial circumstances. Information that should never be available to potential predators. Law enforcement agencies must continue to prioritize elder financial abuse cases and develop specialized expertise in investigating complex phantom charge schemes. These crimes often cross state and national boundaries, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The criminals behind these schemes are sophisticated and well-funded, and they require an equally sophisticated law enforcement response. Telecommunications companies and internet service providers must take greater responsibility for preventing their networks from being used to facilitate phantom charge fraud. The robocalls and deceptive websites that are essential components of these schemes should be much more difficult to establish and maintain. Senior service organizations, community centers, and healthcare providers must expand their efforts to educate seniors about phantom charge fraud and other financial scams. Many victims I have worked with had never heard of phantom charges until they became